The old woman in the village of Saint-Pierre remembered the exact moment she understood that peace had arrived. It was not when the armistice was signed in November of 1918, nor when the soldiers finally came home in the spring of 1919. It was a Tuesday morning in June of 1920 when she realized she had walked to the market without once looking up at the sky to check for aircraft. For 4 years, the habit of scanning the heavens for danger had been so ingrained that she performed it without thinking, the way one might breathe or blink. That morning, halfway to the village square with her basket on her arm, she noticed the absence of that reflex and stopped in the middle of the dusty road. The sky was simply sky again, blue and empty and belonging to birds. She stood there for a long moment, basket swinging gently at her side, and realized that the war might actually be over. Not officially over, which everyone already knew, but truly over in the quiet places of the heart where fear lived. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The years between the wars were lived in whispers, not literal whispers, though there was plenty of quiet too, but the whispered quality of a world that had been screaming for so long it had temporarily lost its voice. From 1919 to 1939, the people of Europe and beyond existed in a strange liminal space, between one catastrophe and another, trying to rebuild lives while the rubble of the Great War still smoldered and the shadows of what would come next were already gathering at the edges of vision. This was not a story that history books told easily. The grand narrative of the 20th century preferred the drama of wars, the clarity of conflicts with beginnings and endings, heroes and villains. The years between were messier, harder to summarize, filled with ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. They worked and loved and raised children. They danced and argued and planted gardens. They tried to forget what they had survived and tried not to think about what might be coming. The immediate aftermath of the Great War was chaos dressed in the clothing of celebration. When the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, cities erupted in jubilation. In London, strangers embraced in the streets. In Paris, crowds flooded the boulevards, singing and weeping simultaneously. In New York, ticker tape rained down on celebrating throngs. The newspapers declared it the war to end all wars, and for a few brief weeks, people allowed themselves to believe that might be true. But beneath the celebrations, a deeper reckoning was beginning. More than 16 million people had died in the war. Soldiers in trenches, civilians caught in crossfire, victims of famine and disease that followed armies like shadows. The Spanish influenza, which had killed more people than the war itself, was still raging across the globe, turning celebrations into funerals with cruel speed, and those who had survived often carried wounds that could not be seen, damage that would take years or decades to fully manifest. The soldiers who came home were not the same men who had left. They had seen things that couldn't be spoken of to people who had not been there, had done things that could not be undone, had lost parts of themselves in the mud of Flanders, and the mountains of the Italian front, and the deserts of the Middle East. Some came back missing limbs or faces, their bodies testament to war's appetite for human flesh. Others seemed physically intact, but carried damage in their minds and souls. What was then called shell shock, and would later be recognized as trauma, that could break a person as thoroughly as any bullet. Families that had spent years waiting found themselves living with strangers who happened to have familiar faces. A mother might look at her son across the dinner table and not recognize the silent, hollow-eyed man who had replaced the laughing boy she had kissed goodbye. A wife might lie next to her husband in the darkness and wonder who this person was who startled awake screaming, who could not bear loud noises, who sometimes stared at nothing with an expression of such profound absence that it frightened her more than his nightmares. The veterans themselves struggled to bridge the gap between their war experiences and civilian life. How could you explain what the trenches had been like to someone who had never been there? How could you describe the particular quality of fear that came with waiting for an artillery barrage, or the smell of gas attacks, or the sight of your friends dying in ways that defied description. Most didn't try. They carried their experiences in silence, creating a wall between themselves and everyone who had not served. This silence was not just personal but social. Communities wanted to move on, to put the war behind them and return to normal life. There was an almost desperate quality to this desire for normalcy, as if by refusing to dwell on what had happened, people could make it less real. Veterans were honored in the abstract. Monuments were erected, ceremonies held, patriotic speeches delivered. But the actual experience of veterans, the daily struggle to reintegrate and make sense of what they had endured, was something people preferred not to examine too closely. Employment was the first practical challenge. Millions of men had been pulled out of civilian economy for years, and now they all needed jobs at once. But the economy they returned to was not the one they had left. Wartime production had created temporary booms in certain industries, but those were already collapsing. Women who had taken factory jobs during the war were being pushed out to make room for returning men, creating resentment on all sides. And many of the jobs that had existed before the war were simply gone. Victims of economic disruption or technological change, the soldiers who had been promised that they would return to a land fit for heroes, found instead unemployment, inflation, and competition for scarce opportunities. In Britain, the government's promises of reconstruction and support largely failed to materialize. In France, the devastated regions of the northeast, where fighting had been most intense, faced decades of recovery, with entire towns needing to be rebuilt from rubble. In Germany, defeat and the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles created economic catastrophe that would have cascading consequences. For those lucky enough to find work, conditions were often poor. The labor movements that had been gaining strength before the war had been suppressed or redirected toward the war effort. Now they surged back, and the early 1920s saw waves of strikes and labor unrest across Europe and North America. Workers who had been told they were fighting for freedom and democracy expected those principles to apply to their working conditions and wages. Employers and governments, facing economic pressure and afraid of revolutionary movements inspired by events in Russia, often responded with force. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had overthrown the Tsarist government and eventually brought the Bolsheviks to power, creating the world's first communist state. This sent shockwaves through every established power, creating both inspiration for revolutionary movements and terror among those who benefited from the existing order. The fear of Bolshevism became a powerful force in politics and society, used to justify everything from strike-breaking to restrictions on civil liberties. In reality, the risk of communist revolutions spreading across Europe was probably less than elites feared, but the fear itself was real and had real consequences. Red Scares in the United States led to deportations and suppression of radical movements. In Germany, communist uprisings in the immediate post-war years were crushed with violence by right-wing paramilitary groups. Throughout Europe, the political center struggled to hold against pressure from both revolutionary left and reactionary right. The map of Europe had been redrawn by the war and its aftermath. 4 empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, had collapsed, creating a patchwork of new nations in their place. Poland reappeared on the map after more than a century of partition. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic states emerged as independent countries. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire's territories were carved up between British and French control, creating new nations and boundaries that bore little relationship to actual populations or historical realities. These new borders created as many problems as they solved. National self-determination, which had been one of the principles guiding the post-war settlement, proved impossible to implement cleanly. Populations were mixed, historical claims conflicting, strategic considerations complicating idealistic principles. Millions of people found themselves minorities in new countries or separated from relatives by newly drawn borders. The movement of populations, voluntary and forced, continued for years as people tried to find places where they belonged. The Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war with Germany, was supposed to create a lasting peace. Instead, it created conditions for future conflict. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war and pay massive reparations that would cripple its economy for years. Territory was taken, its military was severely restricted, and the psychological blow of defeat and humiliation would fester in the German national consciousness, creating resentments that would eventually be exploited by extremist movements. The League of Nations was created as an international body to prevent future wars through collective security and diplomacy. It was an ambitious idea, reflecting genuine desire to create mechanisms that would make another such war impossible. But the League was fatally weakened from the start. The United States, whose President Woodrow Wilson had been instrumental in creating it, refused to join after the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. Without American participation, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions, and would prove unable to prevent the conflicts it was designed to stop. For ordinary people, these grand geopolitical arrangements mattered mainly in how they affected daily life. A Polish farmer cared less about the League of Nations than about whether the new government would respect his land rights. A French shopkeeper was more concerned with inflation than with reparations payments. A German worker worried more about finding employment than about the shame of Versailles. Politics was important, but it competed with more immediate concerns of feeding families and keeping roofs overhead. The early 1920s were years of adjustment and adaptation. Communities that had been disrupted by war tried to reconstitute themselves. Families that had been separated reunited, though not always happily. The rhythms of normal life, work and school, planting and harvest, festivals and funerals, slowly reasserted themselves. There was a quality of going through motions, of performing normalcy in the hope that it would become real. Women who had experienced new freedoms and responsibilities during the war found themselves pushed back toward traditional roles, though not entirely. The war had demonstrated that women could do work previously reserved for men. They had worked in factories and offices, driven ambulances, nursed soldiers, managed farms and businesses. This could not be entirely forgotten or reversed. In many countries, women gained voting rights in the years after the war, a recognition that their contributions entitled them to political voice. But social conservatism remained powerful. The ideal of women as wives and mothers, maintaining the domestic sphere while men engaged with the public world, was deeply entrenched. Women who wanted to work outside the home or pursue careers faced discrimination and social pressure. Single women and widows who needed to support themselves had limited options, concentrated in teaching, nursing, domestic service, and low-paid factory or clerical work. The war had created a generation of surplus women, millions of young women who would never marry because the men who should have been their partners were dead. In Britain alone, nearly 750,000 men between 20 and 40 had been killed, creating a demographic imbalance that would persist for decades. These women had to create lives for themselves that did not follow the expected pattern of marriage and motherhood. Some found this liberating, building careers and communities with other women. Others felt the loss of expected futures, the absence of families they would never have. Marriage itself changed in subtle ways in the post-war years. The war had accelerated trends toward companionate marriage, where partners were expected to be friends and companions rather than simply fulfilling economic and social functions. Young people increasingly chose their own partners rather than accepting family arrangements. Divorce, while still difficult and socially stigmatized, became somewhat more common as people refused to stay in unhappy marriages. Family size began to decline across the developed world. Birth rates, which had been falling since the late 19th century, continued to drop. Part of this was economic. Children were expensive, and in increasingly urban societies they contributed less to family economy than they had in agricultural contexts. But it also reflected changing attitudes about family planning and women's autonomy. Information about contraception, while often restricted, circulated more widely. Women who wanted to limit their family size increasingly found ways to do so. Children who grew up in the 1920s and 30s inhabited a world shaped by the war they had not experienced directly. They heard stories from parents and older siblings, saw disabled veterans in the streets, visited war memorials that listed names of the dead. The war was a shadow over their childhood, a before that adults referenced constantly in ways children could not fully understand. For these young people, the post-war world was simply the world, not a diminished version of something better that had been lost. Education expanded in the interwar years. More children attended school for longer periods, and literacy rates climbed. This reflected both economic changes, industrial economies needed literate workers, and social reforms as governments invested more in public education. The content of education often had nationalistic tones, teaching children about their country's history and culture in ways meant to build loyalty and identity. In some countries, the war itself became a subject of study, though usually presented in heroic terms that elided its horror. Technology continued to advance at a pace that must have seemed dizzying to those old enough to remember pre-industrial life. The automobile, which had been a luxury before the war, became increasingly common, transforming transportation and urban planning. Paved roads expanded to accommodate car traffic. Suburbs developed around cities as people with cars could live farther from where they worked. The social geography of daily life shifted as mobility increased. Radio emerged as a mass medium in the 1920s, creating shared cultural experiences in new ways. Families gathered around radio sets to listen to news, music, and entertainment. Radio personalities became famous. Sports events and political speeches reached audiences far larger than could gather in any physical space. This created new possibilities for both community and manipulation, for connection across distances and for propaganda to reach into every home. Cinema evolved from novelty to major art form and entertainment industry. Silent films of the 1920s gave way to talkies at the end of the decade, opening new possibilities for storytelling. Movie palaces were built in cities, ornate theaters that offered escape from daily life for the price of a ticket. Hollywood became the center of global film production, exporting American culture worldwide. Stars like Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford were recognized everywhere, their faces more familiar than most politicians. Music reflected the contradictions of the age. Jazz, which had originated in African American communities in the United States, exploded into mainstream popularity. The Jazz Age, as the 1920s came to be called, was characterized by exuberant music and dance, speakeasies and flappers, a determination to enjoy life and ignore gathering clouds. Yet beneath the celebration was anxiety, a sense that pleasure needed to be grabbed quickly before it disappeared. The arts more broadly grappled with the war's impact and modernity's dislocations. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and Erich Maria Remarque produced works that captured the war's brutality and its aftermath's emptiness. Poets like T.S. Eliot explored fragmentation and loss of meaning in works like The Wasteland. Visual artists experimented with new forms, cubism, surrealism, Dadaism, that rejected traditional representation in favor of approaches that seemed better suited to expressing modern experiences' strangeness. Architecture and design embraced modernism, clean lines and functional forms replacing Victorian ornamentation. The Bauhaus movement in Germany combined art, craft, and industrial design, creating aesthetics that would influence design for decades. Skyscrapers reached new heights in American cities. Art Deco style combined modernity with luxury, creating visual language of the age. All of this cultural ferment coexisted with profound economic instability. The immediate post-war years saw inflation in many countries as wartime spending and disrupted production systems created too much money, chasing too few goods. Germany experienced hyperinflation so severe that money became effectively worthless. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid multiple times per day so they could spend wages before they lost value. People carried money in wheelbarrows to buy bread. This economic chaos destroyed savings, pension funds, and the financial security of the middle class. The psychological impact of seeing life savings become worthless paper cannot be overstated. It created deep insecurity and undermined faith in institutions and government. The German middle class would remember this trauma, and it would shape their response to the next economic crisis and their susceptibility to extremist promises of stability and strength. The mid-1920s brought relative stabilization. Currencies were reformed, production recovered, trade increased. For a few years it seemed like prosperity might actually be returning. This was particularly true in the United States, which had entered the war late and whose territory had not been touched by fighting. The American economy boomed, creating wealth and optimism that seemed to justify calling the decade the Roaring Twenties. But the prosperity was built on unstable foundations. Agricultural prices remained depressed, hurting farmers worldwide. Income inequality was growing, with wealth concentrating at the top while working people's wages stagnated. Consumer spending was sustained partly through credit, as people bought goods on installment plans that assumed future income to pay for present consumption. Stock markets climbed to heights disconnected from underlying economic realities, driven by speculation and borrowed money. The crash came in October 1929. The New York stock market, which had been climbing seemingly without limit, suddenly collapsed. In a few days of panic selling, billions of dollars in paper wealth vanished. The crash did not immediately cause the Great Depression that would follow, but it was the trigger that revealed underlying weaknesses. Banks that had lent money for stock speculation failed when loans could not be repaid. Businesses that depended on credit found themselves unable to borrow. Consumer spending collapsed as people lost confidence and tried to save rather than spend. The economic crisis spread globally through interconnected financial and trade systems. American banks called in loans to European borrowers. International trade contracted as countries raised tariffs to protect domestic industries, triggering retaliatory measures that made everything worse. By the early 1930s, the world economy was in free fall, with industrial production plummeting and unemployment soaring to levels not seen since industrialization began. The human cost of the Depression was enormous. In the United States, unemployment reached 25%. 1 in 4 workers could not find jobs. In Germany, unemployment exceeded 30%. Families lost homes and savings. People who had considered themselves securely middle class found themselves in breadlines, accepting charity to feed their children. The psychological damage of unemployment, of being unable to provide for one's family despite wanting to work, created despair and anger that would have political consequences. Rural areas faced their own catastrophes. Agricultural prices had been low since the war, and now they collapsed entirely. Farmers could not sell crops for enough to cover production costs, much less make a profit. Foreclosures and evictions forced families off land they had worked for generations. In the American Great Plains, drought turned marginal farmland into the Dust Bowl, where wind stripped topsoil and created massive dust storms that buried farms and forced mass migration. Governments responded to the Depression with varying strategies, most ineffective. Orthodox economic thinking said governments should balance budgets during downturns, cutting spending to match reduced tax revenues. This had exactly the wrong effect, removing demand from economy and making contractions worse. Some governments tried protectionism, raising barriers to trade that only deepened the crisis. Others stuck to gold standard policies that forced deflation and prevented monetary expansion that might have helped. Only gradually, and often by accident, did governments discover that active intervention could help. Public works programs put people to work, building infrastructure. Direct relief fed hungry families. Banking reforms and regulations tried to prevent future collapses. The most systematic approach was President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States, which combined relief, recovery, and reform programs in an unprecedented expansion of government economic role. Similar programs developed in other countries, though the Depression would not truly end until rearmament and eventually war, created massive government spending. The Depression's political consequences were at least as important as its economic ones. Democratic governments that seemed unable to address the crisis lost legitimacy. People desperate for solutions became willing to consider radical alternatives, whether communist, fascist, or somewhere between. The political center, which had been struggling to hold since the war, collapsed in many countries under the Depression's pressure. Fascism, which had emerged in Italy in the early 20s with Benito Mussolini's rise to power, gained appeal as a third way between capitalism and communism. Fascist movements promised national renewal, strong leadership, order instead of chaos. They appealed to national pride wounded by war and economic humiliation. They offered scapegoats, communists, liberals, foreigners, Jews to blame for problems. And they promised action, decisiveness, the appearance of control in a world that seemed increasingly out of control. In Germany, these dynamics brought Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to power in 1933. Hitler had attempted a coup in 1923 and failed, spending time in prison where he wrote Mein Kampf outlining his ideology and ambitions. Through the 20s, the Nazi Party remained marginal, unable to win significant support. But the Depression changed everything. As unemployment soared and democratic governments seemed helpless, Hitler's promises resonated with Germans desperate for change. The Nazi ideology combined extreme nationalism with racial theories that classified humanity into hierarchies with Germans at the top. It blamed Jews for Germany's problems, painting them as both capitalist exploiters and communist revolutionaries in contradictory propaganda that scapegoated them for everything. It promised to restore German power and reverse the humiliations of Versailles, and it offered simple, violent solutions to complex problems, appealing to people who wanted enemies to fight rather than difficult realities to address. Hitler's rise to power was not inevitable. It required specific circumstances and choices by many actors. Conservative politicians who thought they could control and use Hitler enabled his appointment as chancellor. Business leaders who feared communism more than fascism supported or tolerated him. A public worn down by crisis was willing to accept authoritarian promises, and the democratic opposition was divided and ineffective, unable to present united resistance. Once in power, the Nazis moved quickly to consolidate control. They used a fire at the Reichstag Parliament building as pretext to suspend civil liberties. They passed an enabling act giving Hitler dictatorial powers. They banned opposition parties and arrested political enemies. They began persecution of Jews, first through boycotts and legal discrimination, laying groundwork for horrors that would come later. Within months, German democracy was dead, replaced by totalitarian dictatorship. Similar dynamics played out elsewhere, though not everywhere. In Spain, economic crisis and political polarization would eventually lead to civil war in 1936. With fascist forces under Francisco Franco fighting Republican and left-wing forces in a conflict that became a proxy war for larger ideological struggles. In Japan, militarists gained control of government and pursued aggressive expansion in Asia. In Italy, Mussolini consolidated his dictatorship and pursued imperial ambitions in Africa. But not every democracy collapsed. Britain, France, and the United States maintained democratic systems despite depression and political stress. The Nordic countries developed social democratic approaches that combined capitalism with extensive welfare states. Some Eastern European countries maintained fragile democracies. The pattern was not universal, and the question of why democracies survived in some places and failed in others would occupy historians for generations. For ordinary people living through the 30s, the rise of fascism and authoritarianism was part of a larger landscape of anxiety and threat. The Depression continued to make daily life difficult. The political atmosphere became increasingly polarized and violent, and the prospect of another war, which had seemed unthinkable in the exhausted aftermath of the Great War, began to seem not only possible but likely. The rearmament that began in the mid-30s created jobs and economic activity, helping to end the Depression but pointing toward catastrophe. Germany under Hitler rebuilt its military in violation of Versailles Treaty restrictions. Italy armed for imperial expansion. Japan built up forces for conquest in Asia. The Western democracies, which had disarmed after the Great War and clung to policies of appeasement, slowly and reluctantly began to rearm as well. International institutions proved unable to prevent aggression. The League of Nations failed to stop Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, or Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. When Hitler began violating Versailles Treaty terms, remilitarizing the Rhineland, annexing Austria, demanding the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, the democracies chose to accommodate rather than resist, hoping that giving Hitler what he wanted would satisfy him and preserve peace. This policy of appeasement is often derided in hindsight, but it reflected genuine desire to avoid another war among populations still traumatized by the last one. The memory of the Great War was vivid for people making decisions in the 30s. They had lived through its carnage, knew its costs, understood what another such conflict would mean. The desperation to avoid repeating that experience, to find any alternative to war, made them willing to accept compromises that seem naive or cowardly, looking backward. But appeasement failed, because Hitler was not interested in compromise or stability within existing international order. His goals were expansion, domination, and the creation of a racial empire. Each concession only encouraged further demands. When Hitler demanded and received the Sudetenland at Munich in 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned claiming to have secured peace for our time. Within months, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, making clear that promises meant nothing and ambitions were unlimited. By 1939, war had become inevitable. The question was not whether but when. Hitler demanded territory from Poland and prepared to take it by force. Britain and France, having finally recognized that appeasement had failed, guaranteed Poland's independence and began serious military preparations. The Soviet Union, which had been excluded from Western efforts to contain Hitler, signed a non-aggression pact with Germany that secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. The whispered years were over. The world that had tried so desperately to avoid repeating the Great War found itself instead embarking on a conflict that would be even more destructive, even more total, even more transformative. For those who had lived through the years between the wars, the outbreak of new conflict brought many emotions. Resignation. Many had felt this coming and almost welcomed the end of suspense. Fear. Knowing what war meant made the prospect even more terrible than it had been in 1914. And grief for peace that had never quite been peace. For the lost opportunity to build something better, for the knowledge that all the suffering of the Great War had solved nothing and humanity was about to do it all again, only worse. The interwar years had been lived in the shadow of one war and the premonition of another. They had been years of trying to recover while wounds still bled, of trying to rebuild while foundations remained unstable, of trying to hope while evidence suggested despair might be more realistic. They had been ordinary years filled with ordinary lives, births and deaths, marriages and divorces, jobs taken and lost, children raised, gardens planted, meals cooked, love found and lost and found again. These ordinary lives had unfolded against a backdrop of extraordinary circumstances. Economic crisis that destroyed security, political radicalization that turned neighbors into enemies, international tensions that promised catastrophe. The combination of normal life and abnormal times created a quality of unreality, a sense of going through motions while waiting for something terrible to happen. Memory of the interwar years would be overshadowed by the wars that bracketed them. The Great War would be remembered as the catastrophe that destroyed the old world. The Second World War would be remembered as an existential struggle against evil. The years between would be remembered, if at all, as a prelude, a time when the Second War's seeds were planted and grew while people tried not to notice. But for those who lived them, these years were not prelude but present, not shadow but substance. They were the years when people tried to build lives from fragments, tried to create meaning from chaos, tried to maintain hope while fighting despair. They were years of resilience and exhaustion, creativity and loss, joy seized in moments between sorrows. The whispered years lived quietly in the intervals between screaming, years when people spoke softly because they had seen what came of shouting. Years when hope was muted because experience suggested caution. Years when life continued because it had to, because people needed to eat and work and love, regardless of historical circumstances. These were the years that shaped a generation, that created the world from which the next war would emerge, and which that war would destroy and remake. They were years that mattered, that had weight and substance and consequence, even if their significance was quieter than the wars that defined them by contrast. For the old woman in Saint-Pierre who had noticed that day in 1920 that she no longer reflexively scanned the sky for danger, the years that followed brought both relief and new fears. She married, bore children, lost her husband to tuberculosis, saw her sons grow up in a world that seemed to be healing. She watched the depression destroy her savings, watched political tensions rise, watched young men being called up again for military service as the 30s wore on. When war came again in 1939, she was not surprised. She had lived through enough to know that peace was fragile, that the wounds from the last war had never truly healed. She prepared as she had learned to prepare before, stocking food, arranging shelter, steeling herself for loss. And when the sirens sounded and the aircraft returned to skies she had almost allowed herself to believe would stay empty, she was ready. The whispered years had taught her that survival required both hope and realism, celebration and preparation, memory and the willingness to carry on despite memory. She had learned to live between wars, to maintain herself and her family and her community through times that were neither peace nor open conflict, but something suspended between. These lessons would serve her well in the years ahead, when the Second World War would prove everything she had feared and worse. But that is another story for another time. This is the story of the years between, the whispered years, when people tried to live normal lives in abnormal times and succeeded more than they knew. The interwar years were not wasted years or empty years or merely transitional years. They were human years filled with all the complexity and contradiction that makes up human existence. People loved and hated, created and destroyed, hoped and despaired. They made art and made war, made livings and made mistakes. They were heroic and cowardly, generous and selfish, wise and foolish, often all in the same person on the same day. They lived, which is to say they continued despite everything, because continuing is what humans do. They found reasons to laugh even when laughter seemed inappropriate. They fell in love even knowing love could end in loss. They had children even knowing those children might face horrors. They planted gardens even knowing storms might destroy them. They built even knowing what they built might be torn down. This persistence, this stubborn insistence on living even in the worst times was both admirable and heartbreaking. It showed human resilience, the capacity to endure and adapt that has allowed humanity to survive every catastrophe history has thrown at it. But it also showed human fragility, the way we convince ourselves that this time will be different, that catastrophe will not come, that we can build something lasting even on foundations we know are cracked. The interwar years embodied this tension between resilience and fragility, between hope that things would get better and fear that they would get worse. And in the end, the fear proved justified. The world that people had tried so hard to rebuild after the Great War was destroyed again, more thoroughly than before. The lives they had constructed collapsed. The peace they had struggled to maintain shattered. But that does not make those years meaningless or the efforts wasted. The people who lived through the interwar years preserved humanity through difficult times. They kept culture alive, maintained communities, passed on values and knowledge to the next generation. They did the daily work of civilization, even when civilization seemed to be failing, and that work mattered. Would matter even more in the reconstruction that would follow the next catastrophe. The whispered years ended as they had begun, with the sound of artillery and the sight of armies moving across landscapes that had barely recovered from the last time. The generation that had survived one war prepared to survive another, calling on reserves of strength they did not know they still had. The children who had grown up in the shadow of the Great War became adults who would face the Second World War, carrying with them lessons learned in those whispered years between. And when that Second War finally ended, when the world was once again faced with the challenge of rebuilding from ruins, the memory of the interwar years would shape how people approached that task. They would remember what had worked and what had failed, what had brought peace and what had invited catastrophe. They would try to build something more lasting than what had been built before. something that might actually endure. Whether they succeeded is still being determined, for history continues, and the work of building peace is never complete. But the interwar years taught lessons that remain relevant, that recovery from trauma is slow and incomplete, that economic justice matters for political stability, that democracy must be defended actively rather than assume that peace requires work and cannot be taken for granted. These lessons came at terrible cost, learned through suffering that no one should have had to endure. But they were learned and they were remembered, and they informed the choices that came after. The whispered years were not wasted, even though they ended in catastrophe. They were human years, filled with human stories, and those stories matter, even if they are quieter than the wars that framed them. In the end, the interwar years were about trying to recover, trying to rebuild, trying to hope, trying to live. Not always succeeding, often failing, but continuing to try because not trying was worse. The people who lived through those years gave everything they could to create something better than what had been lost, even knowing their efforts might come to nothing. That they failed does not diminish their effort. That war came again does not mean peace was not worth pursuing. That their world was destroyed does not mean it was not worth building. They lived as well as they could in the circumstances they faced, which is all any of us can do. They whispered when the world had shouted itself hoarse, and in their whispers was still humanity, still life, still worth. The whispered years between the wars that defined the 20th century, years that mattered, that had their own story, that deserved to be remembered not just as prelude to catastrophe, but as time when real people lived, real lives loved and lost, struggled and survived, hoped and feared, and ultimately carried on, because carrying on was all they could do. These were the years that made them who they were, that shaped the world even as the world shaped them. These were years of transition and transformation, of ending and beginning, of death and persistence. These were human years, in all the complexity that entails, and now those years are history, fading from living memory as the last people who experienced them depart. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it was like to live between the wars, to exist in that strange suspended time when one catastrophe had ended and another had not quite begun. The whispered years will become entirely historical, known only through documents and testimony, photographs and statistics, the artifacts left behind by people who are gone. But their story remains worth telling, worth remembering, worth learning from. Not because those years were glorious or because the people who lived them were heroes, but because they were human years and those were human people, as worthy of memory as any others. They tried to live well in difficult times. They mostly failed, but sometimes succeeded. They carried on. That is the story of the whispered years, the years between the wars. Not a grand story of heroes and villains, victories and defeats, but a human story of persistence and adaptation, of trying to build lives worth living even when the world seemed determined to make that impossible. A story that ended with new catastrophe, but was not defined by that ending, that had its own shape and meaning beyond the wars that framed it. These years were lived, and they mattered to those who lived them, and that is enough to make them worth remembering. The whispered years, when the world tried to heal and could not, when people tried to hope and struggled, when life continued in the spaces between catastrophes. These years, these people, these lives, all deserve to be remembered, not as prelude, but as themselves, as the human experiences they were. And so we remember them now, as they fade into history, carrying their stories forward so that something of what they lived might persist, might inform how we think about our own times, our own struggles, our own attempts to live well in difficult circumstances. The whispered years speak to us still, if we listen, telling us about resilience and fragility, hope and fear, the human capacity to endure and the human need to try.